and welcome back to the Out of the Fog podcast. I'm the host, Kristina Grace, and this is a special episode because I won't be interviewing anyone today. I'll just be talking to you directly because I have quite a bit to say on maternal mental health. And obviously, we are doing a series on maternal mental health leading up to Maternal Mental Health Awareness Week. And yeah, and last night I didn't get any sleep. And the reason for that, and I'll go back to the beginning soon, but the reason for that was because I basically had some news that was quite discouraging. And as you know, I manage a maternal mental health charity in New Zealand, and yeah, and from time to time, as part of management, a lot of management is resolving problems and driving growth and all of those sorts of things. So it's common to get fires that you need to put out, and it's common to get setbacks. Um, and yeah, unfortunately, it kept me awake as I was, yeah, I guess affected by the setback that we had, and I guess reflecting on a, I would say, 12-year, if not 13-year career, or how would I put it? A championing of a cause, kind of reflecting on all that I have invested and sacrificed and put in to trying to get change within the maternal mental health system in New Zealand. And quite often for me, when I have setbacks, I get super, super discouraged by them. And I feel all my feelings, feel discouragement, feel tired, feel like giving up, feel like throwing in the towel, and then the next day after a, a sleep of any kind, I'll wake up and want to fight and see what can be done to change the situation. So I like that part about my personality. I really, anyone who knows me will know that I have done that in my personal life as well as my professional life. Um, the downside to that is sometimes you do need to let things go when they're ready to be let go. And so that is something that I struggle with a little bit more, and to my detriment. So those of you who are and passionate about change and are championing a change, you will know what I mean when I'm talking about some of this stuff. But anyway, let me go back to the beginning a little bit because I want to tell you from my perspective what has been happening in maternal mental health in New Zealand, Aotearoa. Um, and this, if you're not in New Zealand, this will still be relatable to wherever you are in the world, because my clear understanding is that many of the issues that I'm going to be talking about today are very, very relevant worldwide. It's not just affecting New Zealand. And I know that having spoken to quite a lot of people internationally. So yeah, let me go back to the beginning, and where it started for me. So 13 years ago, I had my lovely little boy who is the world to me. And if he would let me hug and kiss him all day long, I would. So yeah, he's my only child. Um, what I didn't know was that I had antenatal anxiety with him that wasn't diagnosed. So you may have heard me in previous episodes referencing a midwife who didn't screen me for depression or anxiety, even though I stated to her, I'm worried I'm going to get postnatal depression. And she didn't get me help, even though I explicitly said to her, I want to be referred to maternal mental health. And so I went throughout my pregnancy with anxiety. She did treat me as, and in quotes, an over anxious mother. And the truth was is that I actually had clinical anxiety. So rather than going, yeah, this mum may be actually clinically anxious, she treated me as, oh, kind of like excuse my language, pain in the ass. So, yeah, and I had a huge number of risk factors for antenatal and postnatal depression and anxiety. So she majorly dropped the ball. And yes, I did end up making a complaint to the Health and Disability Commissioner, but nothing was really done. In fact, she wasn't even supervised as a result of my complaint. And I've had, just as an aside, I've had people say to me, Christina, because of your really terrible experience with this particular midwife, I'm concerned that you are quite negative towards midwives, and that is absolutely untrue. 110% untrue. I have a lot of relationships with midwives who are amazing, just incredibly amazing, really good at their job. Just the absolute opposite of my experience with my midwife. And Mothers Helpers gets tons of referrals from these midwives who really, really care about maternal mental health. So, yep, so that's definitely not how it is. And I know I'm very, very aware of the pressures that midwives are under, especially independent midwives who are not paid what they ought to be paid, and that there are staff shortages right across the board in New Zealand. So, yeah, I am very, very aware of that. So anyway, going back to my story, so I had my son, and again, you would have heard me reference in other episodes a traumatic birth that I had with my son. I haven't gone into detail. It's not something I like to talk about. I definitely had some signs of PTSD afterwards, but I was fortunate that I was seeing a counsellor and I was able to share my story, and also through making a complaint to the Health and Disability Commissioner and also to the hospital, I felt that those actions really helped me to resolve the trauma that I went through. But I don't like to talk about it. Um, it was and still is I feel grief around the losses that I experienced. And I have mentioned some of this as I've been talking to other people who have gone through traumatic birth experiences as well. And you would have heard me talk about how I had breastfeeding issues and how much of an impact that had on me. I did have postnatal depression and it wasn't picked up for 9 months. And how it got picked up, I was seeing a counselor, and to be honest, it really wasn't helping. And she really felt that I needed to go to my GP. And I did, and I got some medication, and it made a difference. But I was reluctant to go. I was really, in fact, at one stage, I felt like I didn't want to tell anybody how I was really feeling because I didn't want them to send me to the doctor, because I knew that when I went to the doctor, I would go on medication, and I didn't want to have postnatal depression, and I didn't want to be on medication, so I didn't want any of that to happen, so I avoided it. And I think a lot of people would relate to that. To me, it sounds semi crazy because, well, it was, by that I mean irrational. And I was irrational. I kind of felt like if I don't go to the GP and I don't hear, I think you've got postnatal depression, then maybe I don't have it. um, but that was just a form of denial for me because I really, really didn't want to have postnatal depression. So, In the end, what really drove me to finally go, I mean, I got the suggestion from a counsellor. My husband at the time was telling me, I really think that you need to go. Um, and at that point, I was struggling to get off the couch. Like the energy was so low, and I can't really describe to you unless you've gone through it, you won't know what I mean. But I've had glandular fever before with a toddler, and I was more tired and had less energy with untreated depression than when I had glandular fever with a toddler as a solo mum. So yeah, so anyway, um, so yeah, I went to the doctor, I got some medication, I came home and I burst into tears because I was so afraid that through my breast milk that it would affect my baby and I felt like a failure and all of those things. And again, we've talked about quite a bit about this mum guilt and how that mum guilt often prevents you from taking care of yourself. Anyway, long story short, I started to get better. And bearing in mind that my son is now 9 months old, and I'm just starting to get better for the first time in 18 months. Following that experience, I had a burgeoning desire to help other people who had gone through a similar experience because I was really aware of all of the gaps in the system that had let me down because I knew that if it had been picked up earlier, I would have recovered from it quicker. I would have potentially had a different experience in labour. I would have enjoyed my pregnancy more. I may not have even had to be induced because my blood pressure was so high during pregnancy, and I'm convinced that was affected by stress and anxiety, and research will tell you the same. So many things. There's so many things that would be different if it was picked up earlier. And I would have been able to enjoy my son a lot more in those 9 months, bearing in mind he's my only child, was my only baby, my only experience of having a baby. And I had longed for this baby my whole life, and some of us are kind of more maternal than others, I guess, but for me, that is something that I longed for, especially because when I was about 17, I was told that I may not be able to have children due to polycystic ovaries. So for me, he was all I ever wanted. So there was there's a lot of grief around all of that. So it really kind of sparked in me this desire to do something about that and to prevent other people from having similar experiences. And that's where it started from. And Mothers Helpers started off not being what it is today. So initially, we did things like we recruited, and by we, mainly me. It started off with me. That was how Mothers Helpers started. It was just me. Um, and so the Royal We recruited volunteers to help support mums who were struggling and potentially had depression. And it evolved. So it evolved massively through the work of volunteers, my voluntary hours, but a ton of other people's voluntary hours. And that was over years. So for years and years and years, we developed more of a system and we developed assessments, for example. And as a registered nurse, I was really, really good at assessments because registered nurses are. Um, and I ended up doing a postgrad diploma in not-for-profit management, and that really helped me to develop the charity. And I started a master's in social work, and that helped me, or informed me, I suppose, but helped me to develop a program that we ended up using, which is now called Out of the Fog. So all of this happened over a long period of time. And there have been lots and lots of people trained in that program. We also have a Preparing for Parenthood course that helps people with antenatal support, sort of like a psychological preparation for having children, because I think that in antenatal classes we just about talk about everything except the psychological side of becoming a parent, and the psychological transition that you go through, which is hugely overwhelming for most of us. Don't want to speak for everyone, but I think most of us feel that. Yeah, so we developed all of these things, and we were in the end seeing like more than 600 mothers coming to our service every year for help. So that's kind of a very brief overview of Mothers Helpers. And we do assessments, we do counselling, we do group therapy, and we've got clinicians trained in those programs it's not just all settling on me. We've got a board of trustees and a whole bunch of staff. Operates nationwide. However, what we don't have is government funding. And as you can imagine, we've been running for 12 years. I want to say 12 years. You can imagine how hard it is to run a charity without any government funding. And to be trying to fill a gap in health where you really do need clinicians to be involved and who deserve to be paid a good salary, what they're worth, and they deserve to be valued. You can imagine how hard it is to do that. So one of the things that I said, I don't remember what year it was exactly. I'm just going to guess maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I started lobbying government for funding because I couldn't see any avenues in which we could get any. And I always said that lobbying would be my last resort. It was not something I wanted to do, but I said, as a last resort, I will lobby government for funding. The problem was that all of the funding for maternal mental health was going into secondary and tertiary services. So secondary services refers to mental health from the hospital, so mental health support from the hospital, and tertiary services are when you need to be admitted into hospital or even for respite. So those services were underfunded as well. So what they did was they would, and they still do, as far as I know, they take the most severe referrals and treat those as a priority. And what was happening in all of the different regions, and as far as I know is still happening, is that roughly 75% of women who had perinatal depression or anxiety would just not meet their criteria because they just weren't severe enough. So there was this whole section of people with mild to moderate perinatal depression and anxiety that just weren't getting any help, just had no help. And there was no real funding for that group of people. Bearing in mind that there wasn't really any funding for anyone with depression, mild to moderate depression or anxiety, it wasn't just in maternal mental health. So, but what I will say is that there are certain aspects of mental health that get more attention because the statistics are so alarming. So, for example, our youth, we've got a really high youth suicide rate. We have a really high suicide rate of Maori in New Zealand. So things like that would obviously be prioritised because of those high rates. The problem is that in New Zealand, the leading cause of maternal deaths in New Zealand is from suicide. It's not from preeclampsia. It's not from any other physical issue that mothers may experience. It's from suicide. That's the leading cause of maternal deaths in New Zealand, and it has been for a long, long time. So that, unfortunately, wasn't enough or hasn't been enough for the government to do much about it. So from 2010, when I started Mothers Helpers, through to 2015, when I started lobbying government, I hadn't seen any change in that space in terms of government funding earmarked for maternal mental health. So what the gaps were that I could see very clearly, and that everyone who works in this space and everyone who has been affected by maternal mental health will tell you, the gaps are the following. So, number one, there is not universal screening. And in fact, worldwide, for the majority of countries, there is not universal screening for maternal mental health. So, bearing in mind, so coming back a step, so when you are pregnant, you go for checkups with your midwife. She tests your urine for protein. She checks your blood pressure to check if it's okay because she's looking for preeclampsia, right? She'll check for diabetes because there is a risk there, right? But more often than not, she will not screen for depression or anxiety. And yet the leading cause of maternal deaths in New Zealand is suicide. So to me, that's a problem. It's a real problem. There has been I'm trying to think what year it was. I'm pretty sure it was the year that we did a mental health, there was the mental health report, and the College of Midwives at the time wrote a paper saying that they were against universal screening because they felt that it was letting mothers down to screen them for depression or anxiety, but have nowhere to send them after identifying depression or anxiety. When I tell people this, there are a lot of strong reactions to that. And I don't know if the people that wrote that are still working in high positions in the College of Midwives, but all I can say is how much I strongly disagree with that. It really comes back to, if you don't know that you have depression or anxiety, you can't do anything about it. If you do have depression or anxiety, you can do something about it, even in a system that is not perfect, or even maybe a bit inadequate. As a woman who's gone through it and was never screened, I really strongly disagree with that. So anyway, the first gap is, in my experience, is screening. This podcast is brought to you by Out of the Fog. At getoutofthefog.org, you can find counselling or counselling supervision with me, Kristina Grace. There's also online training for therapists in the Out of the Fog program. The Out of the Fog program is designed for counsellors and therapists to use in individual or group therapy. It's holistic, uses multiple evidence-based therapies, and it's effective with up to 90% well within 9 weeks and a 48% reduction in depressive symptoms. The website again, getoutofthefog.org. So I want to tell you a little story. Whether I was running group therapy programs or seeing clients for individual therapy, time and time again I'd meet people that could not or did not want to take prescription medication, or I'd find people that were on prescription medication but needed more support. Now, as a former registered nurse, I'm a believer in prescription medication for moderate or severe mental illness. I support and often refer people to doctors, crisis and mental health teams to be assessed for prescription medication.
But I could see there was a huge interest in natural medicine in my own practice, and so I went to herbalist Jeremy Patterson, who was qualified in naturopathy, and begged him to write a book on supplements scientifically proven to support mental health. I am so pleased to announce that it is now available as an ebook that you can purchase through our website for as little as $5 New Zealand. Not only that, but we have a full range of our very own mental health supplements called scientific supplements. I would not recommend to you anything I wouldn't take myself, and I do use some of these supplements. Go to getoutofthefog.org and take a look.
So we know from research that there has been a low incidence of midwife screening for depression or anxiety. I think that is probably changing, but it's not mandatory. It's not mandatory that midwives screen. And the other thing is that the other gap that is there is that antenatal classes don't have specific education around the psychological transition to parenthood, nor do they have information on risk factors for depression or anxiety. So there are some, I mean, to be honest with you, I think surveys in the past that we've done, we have found like 96% of mothers had risk factors for perinatal depression and anxiety. So probably the risk factors, you're probably going to have at least one. Doesn't mean you're going to get depression or anxiety, but I really feel like why risk factors are important is that potentially your midwife should be watching you a little bit more closely, maybe screening you a little bit more often. So there's no education in antenatal classes about who is at risk of developing perinatal depression or what depression or anxiety looks like in pregnancy, bearing in mind 1 in 8 will experience depression or anxiety during pregnancy, or what it looks like postnatally, when we know 1 in 5 experience depression or anxiety postnatally. And that goes for fathers as well, or partners of mum that are also at risk of developing depression or anxiety postnatally. So none of that is generally included in antenatal classes. So if you've have got a midwife that's not screening, and just by the way, in New Zealand, the lead maternity carer there's a high statistic, and I couldn't quote it to you right now. I'd have to look at my stuff that I've done, written about. But there is a majority of mothers choose a midwife to be their lead maternity carer. So that's why I'm talking about midwives quite a bit, because they're the ones that are seeing these mums. And the most prevalent time for you to develop depression or anxiety is during pregnancy and those first 6 weeks postnatally. So if you are picking it up later, it's most likely been there for a really long time. So coming back to the gaps, there is not a clear pathway for getting help. So a mum might now have been made aware that she has perinatal depression or anxiety, but where does she go for help? The midwife might be aware that she's showing signs of perinatal depression or anxiety, but where does she go for help? And in the past, and I'm not sure if this is still the case, but in the past, there has been a reluctance on both the part of the mother and the midwife to send to the GP, because in the past, that was it would result in medication, or that was the belief, that it would result in medication. And I think everyone felt that was a bit one-dimensional, a one-dimensional way of treating it. But to be fair on doctors, there weren't many options, because they could offer maybe free counselling sessions if they had them available, if they had that available through their practice, but that was it. And an expectation that depression is going to be resolved in 4 sessions is a pretty high expectation. So these are all the issues kind of surrounding that. But there was no clear pathway. Like, if you don't meet the criteria for maternal mental health, and loads of midwives would get their referrals turned down, where do you go for help? And so that was an issue, right? It is still an issue in that it's not clear. I'm not saying that there's no pathway. There is a pathway, but it's still unclear, and I'll come back to that. So I guess the other gap is around funded services in terms of, and that's a real barrier for a lot of mothers, a lot of families. You can imagine they're probably on one income, at least for some of the time. And right now we've just gone through a COVID crisis. It's affected everyone financially. We're now bordering on a recession. You know, interest rates of mortgages have gone up. Like, there's just so much going on, and it's worldwide. Living costs and the cost of housing, the cost of food, the cost of power. All of these things have gone up, and so actually having in your budget a fee, a weekly fee for a counsellor, which is at best $100, more likely to be upwards of $200. It's just not realistic. So yeah, so funded services is another gap. The problem with, and I just want to sort of point this out, the problem with not doing anything in the space of maternal mental health is, or not, allowing these gaps to continue. The problem with that is that it doesn't just affect mum. It definitely affects her partner. It definitely affects the rest of her family, the children in the family, but it especially affects her child. And that child, even during pregnancy, with untreated anxiety or depression, that child is more at risk of developing emotional, cognitive, and behavioral issues. When she has given birth, there's a whole raft of risk factors for her physical health during pregnancy and during birth as a result of depression and anxiety. And I just gave you one example of my own story of how my blood pressure went up, and how I had to be induced. And all of that led to be honest, a traumatic birth experience for me. And it could have led to PTSD. It definitely contributed to my depression and the severity of my depression. So when a child is born and mum has postnatal depression, that can affect attachment. And if you know anything about attachment, a lot of people don't, but when attachment is insecure between mother and child, that child can go on to develop a whole host of issues throughout their childhood, into their teens, and into their adulthood. For example, they're more likely to develop developmental issues, behavioral issues. They're more likely to develop mental health issues. They're more likely to have learning difficulties. They're more likely to get in trouble with the law. They're more likely to attempt or complete suicide. So when we're looking at our youth suicide statistics, we should be starting that prevention in pregnancy. We shouldn't just be intervening when young people are in their teenage years. We should be preventing it in pregnancy and postnatally. So that's why maternal mental health is, in my view, a priority and unfortunately has been neglected. And I'll tell you some examples of how it's been neglected. So basically, people got fed up around, I think I'm trying to remember what year it was. I'm really, really bad at remembering years. But anyway, a few governments back, there was an outcry about mental health in general. And I was part of that. So I kind of, around this time where I was like, okay, we're going to lobby government because, I've tried everything else. I've tried everything I can to get funding to deliver, to address these gaps. And it's just, we're just not getting it. So let's lobby government and see if we can change get them to see that this is a priority. So what I did was I teamed up with some people who were lobbying government in general in an election year on mental health in general. And so we were tagged, it felt like we were tag teaming at the time, where we would do these articles. And so that particular year, we had newspaper article after newspaper article. We had, we were on the news, on television, I was on breakfast at one stage. I mean, in my master's, I had done my thesis on, why are midwives not screening mothers, and unfortunately, the College of Midwives chose not to participate or to share that survey, so I didn't actually get enough participants to form anything but a hypothesis. But the hypothesis was supported by other research, and basically what it found was that there wasn't enough education on certain areas of perinatal depression and anxiety. So um, so that led to me being on, I think it was News Hub, and on Breakfast, and being interviewed and stuff like that. And so all of this kind of was happening in this election year, and there was the People's Mental Health Review, where lots and lots and lots and lots of people, and I can't tell you exact number, including me and including representing Mothers Helpers, we wrote in and we talked about what are the gaps, what are the experiences. We wrote in stories of our experiences of mental health. The People's Mental Health Review report led to Labor government, who got in that year, to do, because they promised as part of their election promises, I guess, that they would do a formal mental health report and investigation. So the trouble with this was that on the panel of that mental health review, there was not one person that represented maternal mental health. They had Maori represented, they had, youth represented, they had all kinds of representation, but there was no one there to represent maternal mental health. Now, at that time, I had by now set up a lobby group, and that was basically to try and separate my lobbying from the charity Mothers Helpers, because it's super, super hard to lobby government and for government to give you funding, because you are challenging them, you're exposing gaps, you're asking for them to change stuff. And they don't really like it. And so I tried to separate the two, because obviously Mothers Helpers wanted the funding so that we could deliver the services, so that we could address the gaps. So I separated those two things and set up a lobby group called Maternal Care Action Group. So any lobbying I did under that umbrella, and any submission I did was often a combined approach between Mothers Helpers and Maternal Care Action Group. So they set up this panel, and then they produced this report. And I can tell you that I cannot tell you how thick the submissions that we had made, Maternal Care Action Group had made, Mothers Helpers had made to this mental health review. It was huge. Our submissions were huge, and I know we were not alone. I know that there were lots and lots of other people in the maternal space who were submitting their stories, so, submitting their, all their submissions. And yet, what we got in the report was about 5 lines referencing maternal mental health. The majority of the mental health report was very, very general. There was a lot on youth, there was a lot on Māori, there was a lot on all sorts of other areas, but maternal mental health was neglected. I think it was literally a couple of sentences. I remember one of my quotes being quoted in there, but like I said, it was a couple of sentences. There was no specific reporting on maternal mental health and all of the gaps that we had outlined, and there were no specific recommendations for maternal mental health. It was so, so everyone was celebrating this mental health report because in general, the mental health report was good. And everyone was celebrating that. But from a maternal mental health perspective, we were really, really disappointed. And this is an example of what I say around how maternal mental health is neglected. So I want to talk a little bit about the type of lobbying that I did in addition to all of the articles and news stories and all of that stuff. And how much work that went into it. And it wasn't just me, there were lots of people involved. So, for example, one year we did an event where we planted 8,000 flowers into a community garden. And that was to represent the 8,000 mothers who experienced delays in diagnosis and also they don't meet the criteria for maternal mental health. So that year when we did that, we had lots of people coming from representing different organisations, and we had the news came and covered it. So we were on television again. And we also had, because this was, again, this was part of that election year, we had every political party, a representative from every political party that was standing for election that year, with the exception of one or two from memory. I'm pretty sure ACT and National didn't turn up. I'm pretty sure, but I can't quote me on that. I will say that the next event that we did, that a representative from ACT did turn up. So, um, but anyway, so we did that, and we were asking politicians to commit to reviewing the maternal mental health space. They wouldn't commit to anything more than that. But we asked them to commit to reviewing it. And the other thing that I did in this election year, and I again can't remember dates too well, was I took forward a petition, a petition to Parliament. And the petition was asking for 3 things. One, for mandatory training of midwives on perinatal depression and anxiety, specifically on the areas that they had shown insufficient knowledge. 2, I had asked for, from memory, going back on my memory here, universal screening. So screening mothers. And the third thing was earmarked designated funding for a service that was clearly showing effective intervention for mothers with mild to moderate depression or anxiety. So that was what I was petitioning for. I went down to Parliament and it was accepted by Jacinda Ardern. She was not In fact, they were in the opposition at that time. She was not Prime Minister at that time. She accepted it and she presented it to Parliament, and you can actually see it as a record there of that petition. So, and what is interesting, and honestly, I'm just going to say, being really open, I loved Jacinda Ardern's leadership as a Prime Minister. Absolutely loved it. But during her leadership, I never saw her personally addressing maternal mental health, and that was disappointing to me, considering that we had taken that petition forward to her. Because of that petition, I got to stand up in front of the Health Select Committee, and I got to present to the Select Committee details, but more information behind the petition. The person, whenever you present to the House Select Committee, there's always someone that uh, is a second speaker, if you like, and they can either support or at least you have to have at least a second speaker or more, and they can either support or they can argue against your points. And we had the director, sorry, the deputy director of health stand up, and she supported everything that I had said. She could not argue with anything that I had presented. And the only outcome from that was that the chair of the House Select Committee said to me, you know, um, I think you guys should get together and talk. And they recommended to me that Mothers Helpers join an organisation called Platform. And that was it. So I did get together with her and talk, and there was really nothing that came of that conversation at all. There was just there were no action points that came. It was it was sort of like we know what the problem is, we know what is needed, and we are working on it. So that's kind of what happened. Over the course of these years, I met I met with everybody that was on the mental health, because they have a cross-party mental health team, I suppose you call them. And I met with every single one of them. And I honestly, I just, it was kind of the same thing of, yeah, this is important. We agree with you. Yeah. I don't know what else to say. That's kind of it. There was no action. There was no kind of action around it. So one of the meetings I had eventually was with Julianne Genter. So Julianne Genter was the Associate Minister of Health, and she also was the Minister for Women. So she was pregnant at the time that I went to visit her, and she basically she was really, really invested in the cause. She listened to what the issues were. She asked me what was needed, and then she spoke to her people and said, "What can we do about this?" And so she really wanted to actually put something into action. And one of the things I said that would really help would be, as the Minister for Women, if she made it mandatory that DHBs, which is now whatu ora, that they would have to include earmarked funding or ring-fenced funding for maternal mental health, so that it wouldn't get swallowed up, by other causes or other needs. Or because the problem with maternal mental health is that it sort of sits under maternity and it sort of sits under mental health, so it can get lost. And so that was something that I felt that she could do. At the end of, and I just said to her, please champion this cause. Please champion it. You will see that there is, I wasn't interviewed for this, but on a program called Sunday, Julianne Genter was interviewed at the end of her, I guess, ministerial term about maternal mental health, and I don't remember specifically what her words were, what the quote was, but she effectively was saying, I really worked hard in this area. I don't know why I couldn't make change happen. I don't know why. And it honestly, I've had so many people say to me, because I have literally talked to all the right people. I've presented all the right information. I've made submission after submission. And people ask me, why do you think it's so neglected? Um, I've been on a I've been on a documentary about maternal mental health and been asked that question, why is it so neglected? And you can see that documentary on our website, by the way, if you're interested. It's right down the bottom and you can click on it. And our website is mothershelpers.org.nz. Um, yeah, so on that documentary, I was scratching my head, and the only answer I could come up with was, well, maybe it's because it's a women's issue. And I do really think that we, as a society, we still have this really high expectation of mothers, and we assume that it's a natural role. We assume that people generally do well in that role, and we expect them to do well, and we expect ourselves to do well. And there's a whole bunch of guilt if we are struggling with that role. So I think it is a woman's issue. I really do. I think that's probably at the root of it.
So that is part one of a two-parter. And that's just simply because I talk too much. It's a really long story, 12 years is a long time. Um, and I don't really want to leave anything out because you'll find out why. In part two, you'll find out why I want to share the whole story. And that is because I'm stepping down from one of my roles. And I'll share more about that in part two. But yeah, so there's a reason why I want to share the whole story and not just bits of it. But thanks for bearing with me, and I really I'm hoping that you've found this interesting and that you will come back and listen to part two of this story. And so yeah, we will see you next week, and then we'll be talking to Kate Hicks from Birth Trauma Aotearoa, because she will have something to say also about the maternal mental health system, which I think is really, really important. So yeah, if you've been following this series, thank you. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your support. If you're not in New Zealand, I feel that all of these subjects are still very relevant to wherever you're living. I think it's a worldwide issue. So yeah, we will see you next week, and take good care of yourself. I'm walking a tightrope between shadow and